Thank you, David. Hopefully we'll get a lot of gasps today. That's basically my goal in life, so that's good. Actually, I did have the opportunity to present a paper at ETS last year that's related to a book I'm working on, the Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing and Virtue Ethics. This paper is a bit of an evolution from that in the sense that it's a slightly different approach, but it has a lot of overlap with that ETS paper, and so it is a slightly different animal. But let's begin, and I trust you have a handout there. First, the question, what do all humans want? When we consider the great diversity of cultures, both today and across time, it seems pretty unlikely that we'd be able to come up with one thing that everyone really wants. When we take into account the massive differences between individuals and all our personalities and our occupations, from artists to engineers to priests to governors to peasants to restaurateurs, it would appear impossible of a task to solve the question of what all humans want. I mean, Mel Gibson couldn't even solve it with what all women want. If you remember that movie from some time ago, and across genders, across society, it's pretty hard to imagine there'd be one thing. Rather, there are a lot of potentially conflicting answers: wealth, security, relationships, meaningful work, connection to the divine, fame, to see one's children's children thrive, peace, health, to name a few. All of these are fair contenders, I think. But despite this great diversity and all these potential answers, I want to suggest that there is something that has been understood and should be understood as really the universal of what all humans want. And we might sum it up with the word happiness. All humans want happiness. Now, happiness, though, here means not the mere description of an emotional state of non-sadness, but the fuller, richer notion of the English sense of this, and some other languages' sense of this as well, of flourishing. Flourishing physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. Happiness or human flourishing does not necessarily mean always having all of one's desires and needs met, for example. Indeed, I think many of us could note the experiential wisdom that happiness and flourishing is often found in the midst more of seeking to attain desires even than having them all met at times. As the old proverb has it, it's not the kill but the thrill of the chase, as many of us have experienced. Nor can happiness or flourishing be reduced, as it often has become in modern Western civilization, to the individual's pleasure experienced subjectively. And there's a whole world of leadership books and popular philosophy books that use happiness and even define it explicitly as one's personal subjective happiness. Rather, happiness or flourishing, I'd suggest to you, is the great and universal desire for life in its fullness and robustness that has always driven the human species. So the great question, and I think answer of ancient philosophy, is this: a strong line of evidence that what I'm suggesting, that flourishing is driving it, actually comes from looking at ancient philosophy of all sorts. Ancient philosophers dealt with many things, including the nature of being, cosmology, knowledge, but sooner or later, most every philosopher eventually would turn his or her eye to the question of the good and how can one achieve it, both together in society and individually. Whether it be politics or education or religion or interpersonal relationships or commerce, how one is to conduct oneself in each of these respects is and should be motivated, according to most ancient philosophers, by what we discern will result in the true and full human flourishing. The focus of ancient philosophers was defining the well-lived life, and many of them called this eudaimonia. You can see that word there, which we can, and most of the time today, do translate that Greek word now as flourishing. The focus on eudaimonia, or flourishing, is found throughout the many and varied forms of a lot of Greek philosophy, for example, Stoicism, and later Epicureanism, Neoplatonism, Aristotelianism. And even though these each have at times radically different visions of how we are to be in the world, what is consistent underneath them is this drive for flourishing. The Stoics, for example, would answer that because of the fickleness and unpredictability of the world and its circumstances, that only the fool would tie his or her happiness to the achievement of, or true flourishing, to anything that is related to emotions. And this is one of the big issues in ancient philosophy, is what's the role of emotions in virtue. The Stoic sage is an ideal person, as Ellen Cherry says, so in control of her impulses and bodily needs that he or she can remain unperturbed whatever may befall them. Unlike Aristotle, The Stoics believed that virtue and eudaimonia were not a function of one's circumstances or fortune. One could flourish, there's a famous debate on this, even on the torture rack. You could be flourishing if you weren't controlled by emotions. Now, that approach to flourishing has actually come down to us, hasn't it? Not so much in a philosophical school, you don't meet a lot of actual Stoics, but in the vestige of this adjective, this lowercase s, isn't it, of Stoic, meaning someone who's sort of non-emotional. Well, that's where it comes from. It comes from this discussion of how do you get human flourishing, and that's one of the views on it, not be emotional. But all ancient philosophies offered a way of being in the world that did promise flourishing. And probably the most robust and continually influential one would indeed be that of Aristotle. Aristotle provided a rich and nuanced discussion of what the good life is and how to achieve it. It's most famously found in his Nicomachean Ethics, written to instruct his son on how to live well and flourish in the world. His argument is that eudaimonia is achieved by adopting a particular way of life and pursuing certain virtues, and that happiness is constitutive of being an excellent person, developed and consciously practicing excellence and virtue over time. It's an art that's lived out. Now today, the study of philosophy, as many of you know, has actually largely moved away from this, although it's coming back in many ways to especially the topic of epistemology, or how we know. But even in the area of moral philosophy and ethics, even in that area where that you would expect this to be the topic of discussion, even there, the issue of human flourishing has actually gone away largely. And most would observe that it's pretty easy to see one of the main reasons that is, and that's because of the mighty influence of Immanuel Kant. Kant's vision of ethics was radically different than the ancient view of eudaimonism. In fact, he wrote off most ancient philosophy or most ancient virtue ethics, or all that ethical discussion, as derisively being eudaimonistic. I mean, he rejected that. That's what he called it, because he saw instead that there should be principles, and of course the famous categorical imperative, these principles that are universal to all people, based in Enlightenment rationalism, that should instead be the true ethics is altruistic. Doing things for one's own human flourishing was anathema to him. Well, that has a big impact on how all of us think about ethics now, and I'm going to suggest it has a big impact on how we think about Christianity as well. Next point, the great question and answer of ancient religion. It's not only modern philosophy and ethics, however, that's lost focus on human flourishing. I am suggesting that modern religious understanding has also lost it relative to ancient religions. Along with ancient philosophies, most ancient religions, I would suggest to you, were also asking and answering the same question: how does one flourish? What can we do to flourish? And the framing of this question within a religious context is going to be a little different, of course, than it's going to be for Aristotle or others, because there's going to be some strong divine being sense of it, or a final divine state, nirvanic otherwise. But religions of the ancient world are asking the very same question, I would suggest to you, and pursuing the same goal, providing their adherents with a way of being in the world that promises flourishing. So Buddhism promises to help sentient beings end their suffering through knowledge and taking refuge in the triple gem of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Islam forges a path to a glorious, flourishing afterlife through adherence to the 5 pillars, of course. Judaism understands the God of the Jews to be the one true and only creator of the world, who makes covenant with his people, through whom alone people can experience ashrei, or flourishing, and enter into a stage, a final age of fullness of life. And those are just but examples, very briefly, of course, not doing full justice to them, but showing that there is this consistent theme. It's important to note, I'd suggest to you, that ancient Christianity is just the same way, that they are very much driven by the question of what is happiness and human flourishing. In fact, it's a remarkable and unfortunate turn of events relative to Christianity's history that few people would, if you ask them today, what is Christianity about? I bet very few, especially even more conservative ones, would say Christianity is about human flourishing. I mean, you just wouldn't get that as an answer. I would suggest to you, though, you don't have to scratch very deeply into Augustine or Aquinas, or really the entire pre-modern tradition, and even to some degree the Reformers, and get that would indeed be a large part of their answer. You're answering the question of what it means to fully flourish. And that leads to the main point of my point here today, that like all philosophies and religions, biblical Christianity offers a vision and a promise of human flourishing. It is a vision and a promise that's different than other religions or philosophies in terms of its content and approach, but it's still answering the very same question. And that's my sort of first plank I need to begin with. Christianity is actually addressing the very same question that other ancient religions and philosophies are. Now, the testimony of the church's history that I've just briefly mentioned regarding human flourishing is very significant and I think informative. Again, even though few Christians would answer that today as what Christianity is about. But, of course, if it's just what Christian theologians have said and it's not in the Bible, I think many of us would want to say, well, at best it might be helpful, but it maybe shouldn't be a central idea for us. But I want to suggest to you in very brief form that indeed human flourishing is a key biblical idea as well, not just a theological idea. In fact, that's where the theologians get it. So very briefly, and the ETS version of this and another version of this I've done is much deeper and more detailed. I've got to do it very briefly here. But human flourishing in the Old Testament. Of course, in approaching a corpus of literature so large and diverse and chronologically extended as the Jewish scriptures, we're always in the danger of reductionism and oversimplification. The entirety of the Old Testament can't be boiled down to one idea or one perspective. There's a powerful and overarching diversity, of course, and many different vantage points. But one such approach that I would suggest to you is very helpful is indeed to examine some key ideas. Now, even that is, in the modern period, in the 20th century, became sort of passé, but I'm hoping we're somewhat beyond sort of the hegemony of James Barr and sort of making us ever afraid of anything, looking at certain words, because words do serve as strong hangers and concepts serve as hangers on which big ideas in the Bible hang. I guess that's what hangers do. They hang things. And so I think, there's always the danger of word studies. I'm not unaware of those things, but I think it is helpful to look at some big ideas and concepts and words and see how they function in the Bible and what kind of role they play. And I want to suggest to you that actually there are three big ideas in the Old Testament that all actually are speaking right to human flourishing. And the only reason we haven't seen it is because of what's happened in our own sort of history of theology, where we've lost the focus on human flourishing as what the point of the Bible and theology is. So the first of these, shalom. As soon as I say that, you could probably immediately begin to see that relates, I think in many ways, to human flourishing. The Hebrew idea of shalom, often translated, probably a little unfortunately, with the word peace in English. In the Hebrew Old Testament, forms of shalom occur all over the place and many related meanings. It's actually a cluster of ideas of ways shalom is used. Consistently, many scholars have observed, it really has to do with wholeness ultimately, or wellness in that sense. And it's a state, it can be a wishing of someone else to have prosperity and wholeness. It can be a state or relationship that is wholeness, free from conflict, and called shalom. That's where our peace idea kind of comes from. And more generally, it can be described as a person and or a society that is functioning together in harmony and completeness and flourishing. I mean, if you just think about it, that's exactly how shalom is depicted, and there are lots of biblical examples we could give. Of the cluster ideas that communicate flourishing, I do think shalom is probably the most significant of them, really the comprehensive umbrella term for human health and wholeness, resulting in strength and fertility and longevity, etc. Shalomness, as I like to call it, is the general state of well-being or security that results from living wisely in covenantal relationship with God. Now, unfortunately, again, as is often the case with any translation, we have come to translate this word shalom with the word peace, which for us, I'm afraid, has too narrow of a couple of meanings. It can mean, on the one hand, either absence of conflict, especially maybe in a military or interpersonal sense, or a reference to one's inner tranquility or serenity. And those notions, I'd suggest, are not absent from biblical shalom, but they're too limited and distinct. Those are parts of the bigger idea of shalom. Absence of conflict and personal tranquility are really benefits, I would suggest to you, of the biblical idea of shalom or well-being, but not coextensive with it. Thus, because of our more limited sense of English peace, I think we've often missed this notion of shalom and how it really is speaking to wellness and wholeness and flourishing. Indeed, through its comprehensive nature and relationship to several other key biblical concepts, again, I think shalom is a main way in which God's entire redemptive work is actually described in the Bible. And just step back and just sort of start thinking about the prophets and how they speak. God's redemptive work is very much described as bringing shalom to the earth. One can immediately think of pictures from the Old Testament's vision of the eschatological age. When God's reign is restored on the earth, the needy are protected, the wolf will lie down with the lamb, the cow will feed with the the bear and the child will play with the viper, from Isaiah 11. The poor will receive justice, the lame will walk. All of this is described as shalom, God's restoration. All those very practical things and places of flourishing are described as shalom. As Wolterstorff notes, the Bible does have a clear vision of what God wants for his creatures, and it is a vision of what constitutes human flourishing and our appointed destiny. It's not disembodied individual contemplation of God. It is the vision of shalom for all the earth. A second key idea is ashrei. Another really key and crucial idea is, and this was actually the word that first set me on this whole, it's not true, it's the second word. The first word was teleos, but this was the second word, makarios and ashrei, that set me on the whole course of thinking about these things. How to translate ashrei is particularly difficult in the Old Testament because it's usually translated with the word blessing into English, but that causes a ton of confusion because there's another word that more directly relates to the word blessing, which is verbally or nominally barak or baruch. The former word ashrei better is described and translated usually, though sometimes the translation is difficult, as flourishing. And the way I've kind of come to depict it is that, this is the confusion in our translations, if you imagine a stick figure or just a person there, barak as a verb or baruch as a state of blessedness is like the arrow coming down from a divine statement, usually word-based, a blessing, or a priest giving it as an agent of that. And ashrei is as a horizontal word that you use to describe who somebody's in that state, right? But we often confuse them because we translate them both as with the word blessed or blessing, but they're related, but they're very distinct concepts. Ashrei is what you say about someone who is in a state of flourishing. And by translating it as blessing, I think it's been another way, just like translating shalom, peace, we've lost the sense that the Bible is talking about something much fuller than just inner tranquility or that you have divine favor. It's actually depicting that God cares about human flourishing. Okay, and there's more that could be said about that. The opposite of an asherism is a woe, right? And you have plenty of these in the Bible as well. Those are not curses. The opposite of a blessing is a curse. The opposite of a macarism or an asherism is a woe, where you're saying that's a horrible state to be in. That's the opposite of flourishing. Okay, does that make sense? The third one then, the final concept is tamim, which again is actually, there's a whole bunch of concepts related to it, and I've just chosen this word to get at it, but it's the idea of wholeness. There are a bunch of words related to this: wholeness, maturity, completeness, and perfection. Another big biblical idea that I would suggest to you, leaning on the work of my colleague Peter Gentry and others that have written this way, that actually holiness is very much about wholeness in the Old Testament as well. I think there's a lot to be said for that view, and I think tamim is one of these words that helps you get at that. It proves to be very important, especially when you bring together tamim with shalom and ashrei. I think you have a pretty strong set of biblical ideas that all are weighty ones. They have a lot of gravitas, and they all end up kind of being slightly different perspectives on the same big idea of human flourishing. It's not an accident that the people who are described as ashrei and shalom in the Old Testament are the ones whose lives are marked by tamim. That is, all this together is a vision of what it actually means to be godly, which is the same thing as what it means to be flourishing. And I'll come back to that here in a moment. So human flourishing in the New Testament, moving right along. The New Testament is not new in the sense that it overturns or disregards the Old Testament, as if God washes his hands with the whole former attempt and starts something entirely different. Rather, the New Covenant is the inaugurated and yet to be perfected by Jesus Christ, the fulfillment and the perfect renewal of what God began to do with Abraham, and even before that, with Adam and Eve. And the New Testament understands the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of the second coming as the consummation, of course, already but not yet, of the work of God from Abraham on, which is, think about Abraham, it's the promise to bring flourishing to all the earth through him. But we should not be surprised then to find that the vision of redemption that's in the New Testament, I would suggest to you, very much has the same flavor of that of the Old Testament. In fact, those same three key terms come across as important in the New Testament as well, largely through the medium of the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. Those three words come across. Shalom comes across very directly as eirene, which again we translate as peace, and we probably lose something by doing that. It's probably lesser of two evils, hard to say. Arene, you start thinking about how that's used in the New Testament. Yes, it means reconciliation with God, but it means more than that as well. I'm suggesting to you that behind arene in the New Testament is the shalom idea. The key word ashrei becomes very directly, with no exceptions in the Septuagint and then into the New Testament, as makarios, which of course occurs very famously as at the beginning of the first message of the first book of the New Testament with the Beatitudes. Beatus is just the Latin word for makarios, and so they become the Beatitudes. I'm now calling them the Macarisms. Actually, I'm going to refer to the Beatitudes as Matthew 5:3-12, but as a general, I think it's very helpful to call these Macarisms because that's what they really are. And in the Beatitudes, or these Macarisms that are at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, what you have is just what you have with the Ashrei statements in the Old Testament. You have these pictures of what human flourishing actually looks like. It's just like Psalm 1 and the end of Psalm 2 and many other, especially Psalms and other texts in the Old Testament, where people are saying, that's what an Ashrei person looks like. That's what a flourishing person looks like. That's exactly what Jesus is doing. He's saying, you know what makariosness looks like? It looks like this, okay? And the rest of the Bible, I think the rest of the New Testament speaks very much the same way. It's interesting, especially here, then to note that word makarios is actually not just a biblical word, as none of these words are. It's actually a pretty common Greek and Greco-Roman virtue word that is a synonym with, lo and behold, eudaimonia. Those words are deeply overlap in Greco-Roman virtue ethics in that they understand this is sort of another way of saying it. The Bible uses makarios, not eudaimonia, but I would suggest to you that it's not an accident those words overlap. The third word, tamim, also comes over into the New Testament with a whole bunch of really important words related to wholeness: telos, teleos, teleates, teleao, teleo. I mean, they came up with every kind of linguistic form of tell that they could, which all relate to this wholeness or completeness or perfection. Okay? And again, it's not an accident. It's very significant to note that the way that the Greco-Roman and the Greek philosophers, virtue ethicists, understood eudaimonia was it was the telos of living a certain way. In other words, all these words are deeply and intentionally overlapping with each other. We'd say there's a strong collocation between wholeness, flourishing, holiness. All those words overlap, and that's not just sort of parallelomania. We're talking about foundational concepts in the worldview of Greco-Roman virtue, and I would suggest to you of the New Testament as well. Now, the point of this essay, Christian Human Flourishing, is to ultimately argue that biblical Christianity is essentially about true human flourishing, and entailed in this claim is that other non-Christian versions of flourishing are not ultimately true. After all, the claims of the Bible are not merely offering one helpful view of things, like many of the other philosophies of the world, but are claims of centrality and exclusivity in terms of ultimate understanding. That's not to say, however, that non-Christians can't experience some real flourishing. There is common grace throughout God's creation, and God in his kindness causes the sun and the rain to come upon the righteous and the unrighteous, and many people flourish. In fact, at times, the unrighteous flourish, it seems, in a temporal sense. God truly does love the world and is at work in every aspect of good. Non-Christians can and do know some flourishing, and non-Christian thinkers can have insight into the wisest and best ways of being in the world. In fact, it's the reading of Aristotle and the examination of consistencies between what he has to say and Christianity that has led many Christians from at least Augustine's time, but I would say all the way through, to consciously plunder the Egyptians, a phrase that Augustine uses a lot, and understand not just sort of selling out or syncretizing Christian theology with Aristotle. It's certainly not even true of Aquinas, so don't think that if you've been taught that. But instead, recognizing there's a lot of insight and common grace and wisdom in these Greco-Roman traditions that can and should be understood from a robustly biblical and theological perspective. All that to say, though, there are differences. There are crucial differences between Christian human flourishing and Aristotelian and other versions of human flourishing. How am I doing on time? I can go. We're doing great. Okay, good. So I list there for you 4 differences, and again, there's much more that could be said, between Christian human flourishing and, we'll take Aristotle in this case because it's the most influential, but other versions as well. And they are different values, different people, different means, and different goals. So I'll go over these briefly. The first difference between Christian human flourishing, in light of what we've seen biblically in a very brief form and theological reflection, the first difference concerns the values or what actually constitutes virtue and the virtues that are to be valued that will result in becoming a teleos person and experiencing eudaimonia. Aristotelian eudaimonia and the Bible share the understanding that to experience flourishing, one must be a certain way in the world. One must live life rationally and intentionally, thoughtfully in certain ways. I would suggest to you that the New Testament, the Old Testament, and Aristotle are all saying the same thing in that sense. The difference lies in which ways of being in the world are considered virtuous, praiseworthy, and therefore which promise true happiness. The Bible is strikingly clear, Old and New Testaments, that the greatest virtue, the highest way of being in the world, can be summed up with one word. And what is it? Oh, come on. Love, right? I mean, after all, that's not just something for 1 John or something. I mean, that's a whole Bible idea. Loving God and loving others. It's there in the Old Testament. It's reaffirmed as the central idea in the New Testament as well in countless ways. You fulfill the whole law by doing it. You think of 1 Corinthians 13, Matthew 5, 43 to 48, just name it. This love, of course, is not mere sentimentality nor merely an emotion, though that's an essential element again, but it's a posture toward the other of mercy, kindness, goodwill, and accompanying actions that accord. This entails showing mercy, forgiveness, and grace toward others. Just start thinking about what a dominant ethical argument that is in the New Testament. Often, note, at the expense, from an Aristotelian perspective, of justice. Aristotle and most of them had no stomach for mercy and grace. None of them did. Justice was the high virtue. It's the thing that upholds the individual and society as well. This is radically different for Christianity, which emphasizes humility, meekness, faith, peacemaking, mercy, kindness, and above all, love. And I would suggest to you, when you go back and read the New Testament, if increasingly you can read it, thinking about the context, especially Paul is writing into a Greco-Roman virtue ethics context, is how everybody thought. It's pretty remarkable to see how radical it is for him to emphasize love. We're so used to that now that we think, of course, that's what Christianity is about. That was a radical statement in the first century to say that that's the highest virtue, right? Not so radical within Judaism, though it was a struggle there too, but certainly in the Greco-Roman world. Different people. Christian flourishing is also distinct from many other views that it consciously and conspicuously is given as a vision for all people, men and women, children and adults, educated and illiterate, rich and poor, slave and free. There's no special priesthood or philosopher class that has the privilege of pursuing virtue. And this is a very old critique of Aristotle, actually, that all his discussion about becoming the teleos man, and experiencing eudaimonia, all of that for him is something that only really the philosopher can do, because it's about giving yourself time to think about what is the right way of being in the world, reflect upon that, act upon it as someone's feeding you grapes, I guess, or whatever. Don't want to be totally unfair to him. But this has been a long critique of Aristotle, even within non-Christian discussions of Aristotle, in terms of that it's pretty unrealistic in the sense that the way he portrays it is sort of for this certain class of people. So that's different. Different means. Christian flourishing stands apart from all other versions of flourishing in that it provides not only a vision, but this is really important, I think, the means by which a person can achieve flourishing. And this, friends, is where the good news of the gospel is particularly foundational and helps make a unique contribution, the unique contribution of Christianity. Because we can achieve eudaimonia because and only because we receive something from outside of ourselves. God's Holy Spirit, to give us power and to reform us by grace. Christianity, you see, provides not merely a set of values or a vision, a really helpful vision of what to contemplate and do and what we should pursue and thereby promise flourishing and receive flourishing. Instead, Christianity, Jesus, the triune God, provides the heart cure and renewal in our souls that actually enables us to pursue and experience true flourishing. Because we have not just a virtue problem, we have a person problem, a heart problem, a whole person, inner person problem. And that's good news indeed. It is this promise and experience of inward change and empowerment for growth that marks true Christianity. All of this comes to the believer through grace, which is understood both as acquittal and forgiveness of past wrongs, and grace is also understood biblically as strength, renewal, and new birth for now and the future. Again, we tend to just think of grace as this backwards thing. Grace is biblically something that is strength for today and hope for tomorrow, as we sing. As Tom Wright actually says very well on this, Christian virtue is not saying merely what the world says, which is become what you can be. That's worldly virtue, become what you can be, followed by the setting out of a program that we should follow. Instead, Christianity is saying what you will be is what you already are in Christ of grace. And I think that's a fundamental difference between other ancient views of virtue or modern ones and Christianity. And the other one is this, and that is the crucial and paradoxical way. The other means of virtue is that Christian flourishing comes through suffering. And that is the most profound and radical truth of it, and deeply Christian truth. This aspect of Christian flourishing is, I think, one of its most distinctive elements. It's paradoxical in that on the surface, and even several levels below the surface, suffering would seem to be the opposite of flourishing. But herein lies the genius and profundity of the Christian understanding. Suffering is actually the means to true human flourishing, not just in the future, but now even, because it refines and redirects our hearts towards God. Suffering of all sorts, emotional, physical, persecution, disease, poverty, psychological rejection, enables, potentially, true flourishing, because true flourishing can be only understood when our hearts are redirected away from ourselves as the end goal and toward God as our creator. This is precisely what suffering pushes us to do. I think this truth is seen throughout the pages of the New Testament. Just go back and read 1 Peter, and it's even in the first chapter, there's all this collocation of virtue ethics words. It's very fascinating. Telos, teleos, dokimos, reasoning. It's a very much a virtue word that's very strong. And it's all about suffering in the midst of that. Or think again about the Beatitudes, the great macroisms of Jesus. The flourishing ones, the makarioi, are described with this shocking series of anti-flourishing descriptions. They're the ones who are poor in spirit. They're the ones who are mourning. They're the ones who are hungering and thirsting. They're the lowly and meek. They're the ones who forgive others. That is, they don't receive the justice they do because instead they have to forgive. All of those depictions of the macroisms, the Beatitudes, are anti-flourishing from a human perspective, but are precisely what Jesus so radically says, makarioi. That is the blessed one. That is the flourishing one. Thus, quite the opposite of how the world would evaluate the matter and quite the opposite of what we think we want, flourishing is found in this life now by the sufferings of this life, which redirect our hearts and hopes towards God's coming kingdom and new creation in which full flourishing will be known. Finally, then, different goals there that Christianity's flourishing is different in its goals. And I give you a little paragraph there. The Christian orientation of human flourishing means that full flourishing can only be experienced when one is in relationship and communion with God. So the goal is communion with God. Full flourishing will only be experienced in the eschaton when God establishes fully his reign and rule. So its goal is not just temporal, it's future. Flourishing, a different goal, directs all glory ultimately to God as the source of our glory. And flourishing is missional, priestly, outward focused, the spreading of God's glory throughout the earth. Now again, we don't have time. It wouldn't be probably that beneficial here to spend a ton of time on each of these. I hope they're generally self-explanatory. Let me just say something about the third one there, glory or doxa, another word that we're all used to hearing and using, and it's, as I always say to my students, it's one of those jargonese words that we all use. If you've asked somebody what glory means, you're pretty hard-pressed to come up with a very good definition a lot of times. I would suggest to you that its main idea is actually splendor and beauty. It's a very powerful beauty word. I think a lot of times for us, especially in the more conservative reformed-ish world, we think of glory as basically, God is awesome, we stink. I mean, that's about as far as we get with glory. Yeah, that's him and I'm not that. And I want to say, well, that's true, but you're missing out. Because doxa and chabod, this glory idea is about beauty and really ultimately about flourishing. And again, when you look at the collocation of this word, it is a very strongly, doxa is a very strongly virtue ethics, flourishing, human flourishing, virtue philosophy sort of word as well. And I think it's very clear in the New Testament as well. Romans is one of the strongest places where this comes up when he talks, for example, in chapter 2 about those not condemning them, seeking glory, honor, and praise. You hear all those words? Those are very common words. Those are teleos, eudaimonia words. Those are exactly what any reader in Rome is going to understand exactly what it means. You are pursuing the life of virtue, which is going to result in praise, glory, and honor. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. That's naturally what you and I all want. Praise, glory, and honor. That's not wrong. What I'm suggesting to you is that this is exactly how, especially Paul, but the New Testament retools and again reshapes and redefines the goal that it is still about glory. In fact, it's still about our glory. And this takes a little bit of a pill for us to swallow, but all you have to do is read Romans again, where what is the end game of redemption? It's not God is awesome, I stink, though that's still true. It's that we actually receive glory, right? Romans 5 is the same way. We endure sufferings because we understand that it is the hope of the glory of God. I would suggest to you, it's not difficult to make an argument there. That's talking about the hope of us receiving glory from God. Now, there's lots of passages that talk about giving glory to God, but there's also lots of passages that talk about us receiving glory, not making us equal with God, of course, by any means. That would be to confuse the source and the experience. Our glory rebounds back to Him, but He does. Our flourishing is a form of glory, and the end goal of redemption is indeed that we will experience this glory, this full flourishing, this wholeness, this radiance that will rebound to Him. So on the one hand, I think Christianity really needs to be challenged to recognize that glorification is not just something for ST3 class that you get to at the end right before the final. That's actually pretty essential to Christianity. And at the same time, recognize that the difference between that Christian view and just a general philosophical view is that all that glory rebounds to God, right? So it's not, we can fall off the edge on either side. It's not just about our glory, but it is still about our glory. And if you, again, I don't have time to lecture on Romans right now. If you just go back and read Romans 1, you'll see that's exactly how sin is defined. We have foolishly exchanged the glory that we could have had and the glorifying to God for something that's not a true glory. So God gives us over to the corruption of our minds so that we cannot figure out what is truly glorious. And all of that is solved then in Romans chapter 12, where through embracing by faith the redemption that Christ gives to us, then, and having access with God and reconciliation with Him, we are, by the Holy Spirit, renewed in our minds, which is our spiritual, or reasonable, is what the word says, form of worship. All of those are virtue terms, I'd suggest to you, and that this is what the background of that is, okay? And fourth, then, the thing about this, last thing I want to say about this is crucial. A crucial difference between Aristotelian eudaimonism is that the Bible is ultimately about, to use Wolterstorff's excellent, well, I don't like his term, but the idea is great, Irenaeism. The term doesn't really work that well. I think I'm going to say eudaimonizing. But what's genius about what Wolterstorff has really challenged us all on, I think, Yale philosopher, is that, a Reformed guy, is that even though the eudaimonistic tradition needs to be in our Christian understanding, that the Bible and theology, God's redemptive work, is ultimately about us flourishing, we will fall into the same error of Aristotle, or the difference in Christianity, say it this way, is that it's not just about us individually as an individual person achieving this eudaimonia, or this eudaimonistic state. The call and mission of God is that we be priests in the world to shalomerize, to make up a Yiddish term, or to uranize, that's not going to work, Irenaeize. Let's just go with eudaimonize. I like that. So for Wolterstorff, it's Irenaeism. I guess he never tries to put it into a verbal form, probably for that reason. But it's I'm going to say eudaimonizing. And that, for me, has been a crucial stage in my own development of understanding these things, is that, it's been a long and important turn for me to understand that the Bible is about human flourishing, But we also, at the same time, need to be challenged that it's not just about our individual human flourishing. We are called on mission to be priests, a kingdom of priests in the world, which is because that's God's mission, right? To shalom the whole world, okay? So, what are some implications to just close it up here? First, at a macro level, I just want to offer a call to us as Christians to reorient our understanding of the Christian faith around this foundational human question of flourishing. It's not a new idea, a new way of thinking about Christianity. It's a very ancient idea and way of thinking about Christianity. But I want to call us to a renewal of this, that this is not a small issue. This is at the core, the idea of God restoring creation itself and us to a state of whole human flourishing. And in that way, it's going to greatly affect the way we think about our Christian faith, free from the tyrannical and unbiblical specter of Kantian altruism. And in that, I pulled out this week this old dog, right? I got this in 1991 or 1992. The guy I was mentoring right after it came out. We read it. I had no idea what it meant. It was way over my head at the time. But this is Desiring God. And then notice that subtitle, which he kind of moved away from a little bit. And he actually defends why he uses the word hedonism. But he moved away from that word for quite a while. Maybe he's come back now, I don't know. But he has a whole appendix in this edition anyways of why hedonism is an important word. But as I pulled this thing out again, I mean, I'd remembered this passage 1,000 times over because I also have been greatly influenced by Lewis, as Piper confessedly is. But it was fun to go back and just sort of think about what Piper's saying here, or what he was saying. I don't know if he'd say it quite the same way, but he has this important quote right at the beginning from C.S. Lewis, that talks about virtue, it talks about the Stoics, and it talks about Kant, which you've probably read, but hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense, because Lewis understood exactly what I'm talking about. He was classically trained and understood virtue, I would suggest to you, as part and parcel of Christianity. But here's what Lewis says in this famous passage many of us know from The Weight of Glory. If you've asked 20 good men today what they thought the highest of the virtues, 19 of them would reply unselfishness. But if you asked almost any of the great Christians of old, he would have replied, love. You see what's happened? A negative term has been substituted for a positive, and this is more than of philological importance. The negative ideal of unselfishness carries with it the suggestion not primarily of securing goods or things for others, but of going without them ourselves, as if our abstinence and not their happiness was the important point. I don't think this is the Christian virtue of love. The New Testament has lots to say about self-denial, but not about self-denial as an end in itself. We are told to deny ourselves and take up our crosses in order that we may follow Christ, and nearly every description of what we shall ultimately find, if we do so, contains an appeal to desire. See, he understands the emotional element of virtue here. If there lurks in most modern minds the notion that to desire our own good and earnestly to hope for the enjoyment of it, which I would call flourishing, I submit that this notion, the rejection of that in Christianity, this notion has crept in from Kant and the Stoics and is no part of the Christian faith. Indeed, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. And we all know this passage, I think. This is our second Bible, after all. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. Piper's no dummy, and he wasn't a dummy then. He understood what Lewis is saying, and he intentionally calls his vision, which is radical. And I remember in the 90s, it was particularly radical. Nobody was saying, especially the Reformed people, were all like, right? And he was very, good thing we got that on tape. He was an amazingly breath of fresh air by talking about pleasure and happiness. Some of you older guys remember how different that was in the 90s. I remember it very distinctly. And it's interesting that he calls it hedonism. And he's intentionally using this term in an opposite way. Well, I'm going to suggest to you this is all part of the same, and we're now at a place where I don't think I'm going to use hedonism because I think that's not the most helpful for what I'm doing here. But if you think about hedonism is a view of a way of being in the world that is completely self-centered with no idea of virtue. It's just about immediate pleasure. Eudaimonism stands over against that as saying, you know what? Immediate gratification is not really going to satisfy. You're on the treadmill of dissatisfaction and decreasing satisfaction. eudaimonism is very much an alternative within philosophy to hedonism. It's saying you need to think about it and you need to pursue virtues that are going to result not in immediate gratification always, but in true flourishing. I want to suggest to you now, as Christians, we need to take it the next step further and say there's actually something even more important than eudaimonism, although that's not unimportant, and that's Irenaeism, or eudaimonizing, that we are called to flourish and to bring that flourishing to the world. So my point in this is that I'm really suggesting a reorientation, which is really a renewal of the concept of what God's redemptive work is really about. God's redemptive work is about bringing us back into full and true humanity, which can only come through the God-man, the second Adam, Jesus the Christ, and the call upon us then to eudaimonize the world in that way through his work. And so that's, I guess, I kind of blended things together here, but that's, I think, the biggest thing to challenge us with, and to recognize that even in the midst of that, what we're talking about is a reoriented form of happiness that includes suffering because it is focused on the man of sorrows who is bringing about the age of true human flourishing in and through us. Amen. 8 minutes. Okay, good. 8 minutes. Yes, the real philosopher. I was a little paranoid of you. All right.
I really enjoyed this.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Great stuff here. Just a little word for Kant. I agree with what you're saying about
Yeah.
Kant, but I've known
Yeah.
evangelists who signed on to go to a little bitty church, no-name church, to do a meeting, and then First Baptist Church, Capital City, called, and they walked out, and they said, well, I can't,
Yeah.
something's come up, and they go to the bigger deal.
Yeah.
And this is not what you're saying
Yeah,
at
yeah.
all, but a little Kant there sort of helps.
Yeah.
Well, wait, I would flourish there. My ministry, broader,
Yep,
sweet.
good.
That flourishing word can be misused.
Absolutely.
And if they have a little Kant, they say, I told those people I'd be there. By George, I'm going to be there. So he puts a little spine in it.
Yeah, that's good.
So a little word for him.
Yeah.
Quick questions. The
Please.
Commonweal Project. I was wondering about public policy. Pot in Colorado. Okay, so we are.
I'm so glad you asked. I wanted to get on public record about this.
No, I'm just wondering, if I want to then extend eudaimonistic ethic and spirit to public policy, do I say on the one hand, that's just what Colorado needs, because you've got temptation there, you've got greater danger from bad drivers, you've got greater contrast between the virtuous and the pothead. Libertarian is that will create the real emergence of virtue. Or the other is these people are wrecking themselves.
Right.
They're potheads. We need to move in public policy and help them to be their daddies so they don't wreck themselves. What's the application of eudaimonism to public policy?
Yeah, that's great. I think we probably would think of it the same way, and I know you've spent a lot more time probably thinking about public policy than I have. But what I would take from this is that to be a Christian is to orient ourselves to God's revelation that trains us into what true human flourishing looks like. And then our role as Christians is to bear witness to that and invite people into it. In terms of how you actually affect that in public policy wise is the trickier part that I don't have a clear answer for. I don't think any of us do. But what I would say strongly is that we do have a role and a responsibility in society to both, again, invite people into true human flourishing and to try to effect ways of being in the world. I probably including through policies, that are good for people, that will result in flourishing. When the devil's in the details, then in terms of what that works out in any particular situation, because we are also in a secular society, which I'm glad we are. Right, in the sense, right? I'm very glad to have freedom of religion. I think we need to promote that. And that means that it's not just up to us what policy is, although we can have a voice in that. That's how I'd answer that. It's a tough one. Thank you. It's a good issue. So, so on Kant, yeah, I guess I'd say that I agree with you. I think a good virtue ethics, especially a Christian one, doesn't need Kant to also say that, right? But I understand you're kind of setting it up as a typology that it's good. And this is a problem, I guess I didn't say this. This is a problem with the pure virtue ethics view, which I wasn't really addressing exactly, is that ultimately a pure virtue ethics view doesn't have an ability to say what is ultimately right or wrong. And I think that's a fair critique. And that critique has been made by other Christian virtue ethicists. I mean, I would count myself a virtue ethicist. I mean, I think that view is the right way of understanding what ethics are. But as a Christian virtue ethicist, I think there is a revelatory pole that makes certain very clear objective moral realities that a virtue view can't by itself actually accommodate.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
An evangelist who tosses the little church to get the big church, he's an idiot in terms of eudaimonism.
Yep.
He's going to corrupt his soul.
Probably so. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, thank you. Good. Another question? Comment? Yes.
I'm just wondering, with eudaimonism, as you described, is deeply tied to the means by which it's brought about, and also recognizing that part of that is going through the process of suffering and kind of a delayed hedonism in some ways. So then how does that affect we approach social involvement when in some ways by seeking a level of shalom temporarily it could interfere with the means by which full flourishing could be brought about?
I think you know the answer to that. Right? Because what the call upon us is to indeed bring about shalom. We're not called upon to bring about or prevent the alleviation of suffering, even though we know that's often the instrument or means by which flourishing occurs. That's up to God, right? What's clear to us is that we are called as shalom agents, as priests of blessing and priests of makariosness. There's going to be plenty of suffering, even if we all dedicated ourselves fully to righting wrongs in the world. We're not going to be able to prevent it, just disease and natural disaster, et cetera. So I'd say what's clear to us is the call to be priests of that. So thank you. Joseph?
Yeah, you and I have talked about this verse before, so I was listening to try to find a place to sort of fit
Sure.
this verse into your discussion, but where would you put Ashrei, blessed is the one who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock?
I love these. Potted marijuana, Babylonian babies getting heads crushed, some of my favorite topics. So, I don't have a great answer, Joseph, and I know we've talked about this a little bit. I mean, I think, again, an asherism, a macarism, is a statement from another human's perspective on what a state of happiness or flourishing is. And so, there are broader issues with how to interpret that verse generally, right? Mm-hmm. But I would say it's still, with those other things put aside for a moment, it's clearly the psalmist is there saying, this is a state of flourishing, those who are opposed to God's enemies and those who are crushing God's enemies. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know how to answer it beyond that. I mean, there are other things to say about that.
My concern is,
I don't think that goes against the asherism, is what I'm saying.
The degree to which you're pushing shalom, I mean,
right.
Does shalom, are we willing to sacrifice some people on the altar of shalom?
Yeah.
In other words, is it necessary to, and this is particularly perplexing because
Sure.
we're not talking about the people, we're talking about the kids.
Yeah, totally.
But are some, I mean, so for example, these drone strikes, we're doing these drone strikes and we're killing civilians.
Right.
Is this the natural consequence of what it takes to establish shalom in the world?
Right.
There's going to be collateral damage.
Yeah. No, I understand, and of course those arguments are the big whole just war arguments, et cetera. And of course it's a bigger issue from within an Old Testament context, as you well know, in terms of what is God's activity here. I think from within a New Covenant, New Testament perspective, it's a little easier to answer in that we are not called as a nation who is doing things. We're a sojourning, suffering people. And so I'm sorry, Joseph, I can't answer the problem of, I mean, it's fair. I'm not saying you shouldn't ask it. I'm just saying I don't have a great answer for how God's destruction of other nations is easily reconcilable with shaloming. No, but yes.
Could we say something about like theocentric morality? In that, our vision of flourishing is radically different from modern cultures. In a similar way that ancient Christian flourishing was different from Greco-Roman flourishing, if you highlighted suffering. So we have considerations of God's centered morality in flourishing, which is kind of how I could see a text like this making sense, because it's righteous, it's actually just.
Right. I don't disagree. I just don't want to punt too quickly to that. I think we can tend to punt there too quickly, honestly. So, I mean, I think we need to wrestle with those questions. Ultimately, that is going to be the answer, right? Of course, if we believe in a God and not just ourselves is ultimately authority. But I think it's fair to wrestle with those, though, a little bit more than that, you know. But that's good. Thank you. I think we're out of time. Thanks. All right.